The wind arrived before anyone understood what it was bringing. It came off a thunderstorm that never dropped its rain, a wall of cold air rolling downhill out of a dying cell. And when it reached the fire, it did the one thing nobody standing in front of a fire ever wants the weather to do. It turned the fire around. This is the story of 19 men who did everything they were trained to do, everything they were told to do, and were dead before sundown anyway. And it is the story of 2 official reports about that afternoon that cannot both be comfortable to read, because one of them says nobody broke a single rule, and the other says the system those rules belonged to had already decided what their lives were worth. Yarnell, Arizona, is a town of about 650 people in the hills northwest of Phoenix, ringed by chaparral that had not burned in roughly 45 years. By the summer of 2013, that brush stood taller than a man in places, cured by 2 years of drought into standing fuel. On the evening of June 28th, dry lightning came through and left a small fire on a ridge above the town. It sat on federal land in rough country, and for a day and a half it stayed small, a few hundred acres, the kind of fire the West produces by the dozen every summer. The crew that came to work its edge on the morning of June 30th was, by every account in the record, one of the best in the country. The Granite Mountain Hotshots were the only hotshot crew in America run by a city fire department, and Prescott wore that like a badge. 20 men, most of them in their 20s, fathers of young children, a former Marine whose wife was carrying their first child. In the summers they lived out of a buggy and a line pack, and in the town they were something close to famous, the crew that got sent to the worst of it, from New Mexico to California, and came home. Their superintendent, Eric Marsh, was 43, a man who had built the crew from nothing over a decade and drilled it on one idea above all others: know your escape paths and keep one foot in the black. The black is the ground a fire has already burned. It sounds like the last place on earth anyone would stand. It is the safest place there is, because fire does not come back for what it has already taken. 19 of them went up the ridge to cut line along the fire's southwest edge, anchored in the black. The 20th, a 21-year-old named Brendan McDonough, was posted below as lookout, alone on a knoll with a radio, a weather kit, and a trigger point, a line drawn on the ground in his mind. If the fire crossed it, he was to call his crew and leave. Nobody thought the fire was coming his way. It was moving northeast, away from everyone. The warning was already in the system by early afternoon, and this matters because it was written down and read aloud. The fire weather forecast that day called for thunderstorm outflows, winds turning and gusting past 40 miles an hour, and at around 3:30, the warning went out over the radio to everyone on the fire. A storm cell to the north was collapsing, and its wind was coming. An outflow boundary is a simple, brutal thing. A dying thunderstorm lets its cold air fall, and that air hits the desert floor and spreads like water poured from a bucket. And whatever direction the fire had been obeying before, it obeys the new wind now. At 4 o'clock, the fire was moving away from the crew at 1 mile an hour. By 4:30, the outflow arrived. The wind swung nearly 180 degrees, and the fire came back the way it had come at 10 to 12 miles an hour, a wall of flame bearing down on Yarnell. Hundreds of homes stood in its path. Evacuations began in a scramble, and the fire crossed Brendan's trigger point. He did what the rule said. He radioed his crew that the fire had turned, that it was coming, and he pulled back as the flames took the knoll where he had been standing. Another crew picked him up. He was the last member of Granite Mountain anyone reached, because up on the ridge, the 19 made a decision that no report has ever fully explained. They were safe. They were standing in the black, and everyone directing the fire believed that is where they stayed. Instead, at some point after 4, they left it, dropping off the ridge into a box canyon of unburned chaparral, making for a ranch at the canyon's mouth that had been designated a safety zone. The shortest way there led through the exact ground the fire was about to want. For roughly half an hour, nobody watching the fire knew any of this. The operations map still had them in the black. The aircraft overhead were pounding retardant ahead of the fire's run at the town, not the canyon. On the radio, the channels were saturated with an evacuation. 19 men walked down into brush over their heads, where they could not see the fire, and the people who could see the fire could not see them. At about 20 minutes to 5, Eric Marsh's voice came up on the air-to-ground channel. He said they were cutting a deployment site and burning out around themselves. The air attack officer overhead did not understand what he was hearing, because as far as anyone knew, Granite Mountain was in the black. He asked more than once where they were. The answers came back through smoke already darkening to nightfall, and then they stopped coming at all. A fire shelter is a thin envelope of foil and silica that a firefighter shakes open and pulls over their body on the ground. It reflects radiant heat. It is rated for a fire that passes over. It is not rated for a fire that stays, and in that basin, the fire had found a natural chimney, driven by storm wind through brush that had waited 45 years to burn, with flames running 60 to 80 feet tall. The 19 deployed their shelters in a shallow bowl 600 yards from the ranch. Air temperatures at the site exceeded anything the shelters were built to survive. Helicopters tried to reach the basin and were turned back by smoke. At about 6:30, a medic walked in through the still smoking brush and confirmed what the radio silence had already said. 19 men. The deadliest day for American firefighters of any kind since September 11th, and the deadliest for wildland firefighters in 80 years. In Prescott, the cruise station stood open that night with 20 parking spaces and 1 truck missing. A week later, 19 white hearses drove the 100 miles from Phoenix to Prescott, and people stood on every overpass on the way. Then came the paperwork, and this is where the story stops being a tragedy and becomes a postmortem. The state convened an accident investigation, the formal kind, with a team drawn from across the country. Their report ran 116 pages, and its conclusion was, in its own words, that the crew was fully qualified and trained, and that the investigation found no indication of negligence, no reckless actions, and no violation of policy or protocol. 19 men were dead, and by the official account of how wildland fire is fought in America, every decision on that mountain was within the rules. The report pointed at one gap it could prove. For half an hour, the people running the fire did not know where their crew was, and the crew did not know what the fire had become. 3 months later, Arizona's workplace safety regulators read the same afternoon and wrote a different document. They cited the state forestry division for a willful and serious violation, the gravest category they have, and fined it more than $500,000. Their findings said the quiet part in plain administrative prose. The state's suppression strategy that day prioritized the protection of non-defensible homes and pastureland over the safety of the people fighting the fire. The houses the fire was racing toward could not be saved, and the state kept crews in front of it anyway. Put them side by side, and the 2 reports say something neither says alone. One says the men followed the system. The other says the system itself was aimed at empty buildings. Both of them are official. Both of them are true. Nobody broke the rules on the ridge above Yarnell, and that is the most damning sentence in either report, because it means the rules were never built to say no on the afternoon it mattered. The families buried 19 men, and then some of them had to fight for the deaths to count. Prescott had carried 13 of the 19 on its books as seasonal employees, and the city's first answer to their widows was that seasonal men did not earn the same survivor benefits as permanent ones. It took public fury, lawsuits, and a change in state law before that arithmetic was corrected. Within a year, the city had dissolved what was left of the crew. Brendan, the lookout, spent years answering a question no report could close for him, the one he said out loud to every camera that asked, "Why not me?" The basin where they deployed is a state park now, with 19 crosses in a ring where the shelters lay, and a trail down from the ridge so that anyone can walk the last 1,000 yards themselves and feel how short it is. Somebody wrote the wind warning, and somebody wrote the 2 reports that cannot agree on what happened to the 19. But the postmortem writes itself. The only question is whether anyone reads it before the next one.